In recording, today's agenda will include the following things. We have a lot of guest speakers. We have friends from the Inclusionary Practices and MTSS team who will be talking about inclusionary practices for multilingual learners. We have a guest speaker from the Washington Office of Education Ombuds, and we have Leslie Huff from our assessment team to talk about WIDA access updates. We know many of you have started testing this week, and we'll conclude with a few resources and additional opportunities. And with that, I'm going to be turning it over to Jamie Kidder and RJ Monton to talk about inclusionary practices. Welcome, Jamie and RJ.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having us. I think I'm kicking us off. So I'm really glad to be joining you all. My name's Jamie Kidder. I work in the Special Education Division here at OSPI, and I'm a program supervisor in that role. A lot of my work relates to inclusion and belonging for students with disabilities, but I want to first start by saying that when we're talking about inclusion, we're really talking, we don't want to think only about students with disabilities when we're thinking about the word inclusion. So what I'd like to ask you to do, maybe just for about 15 to 30 seconds before we start, is just think on your own. You don't need to put this in the chat unless you would really like to, what you think of when you think of the word inclusion. And then we're going to do a little bit of unpacking of that. So maybe just take about 30 seconds, reflect on what that means to you, and then we'll come back together. Take about 5 more seconds. Thanks for doing that. I think it's a term that means a lot of different things to a lot of people. And so, and it can encompass a lot of things. So we're going to talk a little bit about what this means and why it's important for our students. Next slide, please. Awesome. Okay, so here is a definition of inclusion that our team really likes in special education. So I'm just going to read it and maybe we can reflect on this too. Inclusion is engagement within a community where the equal worth and inherent dignity of each person is honored. An inclusive community promotes and sustains a sense of belonging. We're going to come back to that idea in just a few slides. It affirms the talents, beliefs, backgrounds, and ways of living of its members. If you're like me, you may sort of be familiar with the term inclusion because you were familiar with the term mainstreaming from some time ago, where it was like, well, mainstreaming is we kind of just put everyone in the same classroom and we see how everybody does, and we're sort of treating everybody exactly the same. And then that brings a lot of challenges with it. I really, as you were reflecting on your thoughts about inclusion, I'm wondering how closely it aligned to this sort of definition, or where there might, or if you were sort of more like me in thinking about it along the lines of, like, oh, maybe it's sort of like that old idea of mainstreaming. What we want to think about with inclusionary practices is we want to think about this as a shared responsibility to create a community where inclusion is possible, rather than thinking about it as something that only certain students can be included or are ready to be included. It's really about whether we've built a community that does include all of our students. So just something to think about as we get started. So as we're thinking about who we're talking about in terms of inclusion, we want to make sure that we're thinking about who is maybe not able to be included in the systems that we work within. So maybe reflect on who you see in your schools as being pulled away from that inclusive school community. Maybe it's a multilingual learner who's new to the country. Maybe it's a student who has an intellectual disability. Maybe it's a student who has been subjected to a lot of exclusionary discipline and is missing out on a lot of that time in our school communities. It might be a student who uses assistive or augmentative communication to communicate. So maybe they use picture symbols or some other form of alternative communication based on a disability. Or maybe it's a student who we think of as like, they're defiant, they're disruptive, because there's something about the school-wide behavior support structure that isn't really that robust or doesn't work for them. And so we've labeled their behavior as a problem. So those are some students I want us to kind of hold in mind as we're talking about inclusion today. So we wanted to share this quote as well, and I think it's applicable to a lot of those marginalized student groups. So this is a quote from Michael Giangreco out of the University of Vermont, and Michael says, "For every student who remains educationally segregated, there are other students with similar attributes, abilities, and needs who are successfully included. This simple fact suggests that whether a student with a disability is meaningfully included may have less to do with their characteristics and more to do with the attitudes, skills, structure, and practices of the adults responsible for providing education." And we see this in special education a lot. We will see, we'll go into schools and see classrooms in which students who have, even students with extensive support needs, are really successfully included in general education settings. And that is an experience that benefits that student and also benefits the other students in the classroom and benefits the adults. And then we'll go into other schools and folks will say, well, naturally, we can't include those students. You know how it is. And it's really tough because we know that it's possible, that inclusion is possible. But it's really a question of whether we've designed our systems to be inclusive of all students, rather than saying, oh, it's some essential quality of the student that makes them unable to be included. So we can move to the next slide. Awesome. So sort of reflecting on that, we would see everyone is responsible for inclusionary practices. So I won't read this quote, but I will just for the sake of time, but I'll kind of summarize here. We sometimes think of inclusionary practices as falling in sort of special education's responsibility to implement. And the reason that's tough is that inclusion can't take place in special education settings. Inclusion is about moving out of those settings into general education settings. And so we want to make sure that, special education wants to partner with folks to make sure that inclusion can happen, but it has to be a shared lift and a shared, I was going to say responsibility, but I really think of it as a shared honor to make sure that we're looking for our students who are marginalized typically in our school communities and make sure that we're building those communities so that they're really lifting up all of our students and our places where our students' strengths and unique differences are really honored rather than, treated as something that we're trying to avoid. So really, this is a shared responsibility. All right, so if we're thinking about what the research says about inclusion, we have over 80 years of research that has told us that placement in general education settings improves outcomes for students with disabilities. So we have a lot of meta-analyses that unpack this more, and there's some brief citations here if anyone is interested in following up. But we have a lot of really compelling evidence that tells us that inclusion works for our students with disabilities. We also have a lot of evidence that suggests that inclusion benefits all students in those settings. So it has positive impacts on students who don't have disabilities as well. And I think that really speaks to the fact that when we create these really vibrant, inclusive spaces, that's good for everyone. We can understand that there are these sort of individual learner differences that enrich our communities rather than making them worse. So this benefits all of our students. Move to the next slide. Thanks. So when we're thinking about that lens of inclusion, we really want to ask ourselves if we're committed to building a system that meets the needs of all of our students rather than just some of our students. And you can click again, there's a little slide animation, thanks. Or are we thinking about inclusion in this sort of way where we're thinking, oh, it's really just one more thing. We have this initiative, we have that initiative. When we're thinking in that kind of sense of these different siloed practices, it can feel really complex and difficult to get started. But I think the key point here is that when we're thinking sort of from the ground up at that systems level about how to build a school community that really is organized around meeting the needs of all students and layering in those supports, we can really create a space where all students can feel a sense of belonging.
Jamie,
You
I
may
love
click one
how
more
this
time.
speaks to all students,
Yep.
including our multilingual learners, and building that system where they can be fully included in everything, as well as our students with all different types of abilities.
Yep. Absolutely. So it's important for us to think about how we can move forward together and leave behind dangerous assumptions like this student can't be included, that student can't be included. And the reason that we sort of started off with thinking about these students who are being pulled away from community is that sometimes sometimes I'll visit schools where we're doing a great job including one group of students, but we're not doing such a great job including another group of students. And so we really want to be thinking about that school community and whether it's a space that draws students in and is really built with all those students in mind. All right, so very quickly, we're going to move through a little reframe. So I won't ask you to do this in the chat for the sake of time, but we want to try to reframe some of these kind of medical model ideas around students who have disabilities. And I think you'll see parallels to other groups of students in this as well. So the first one, disability is a deficiency. And if you could click, we'll just move through these animations. An inclusive model would reframe this to say differences are experienced by everyone. That's really true. The medical model might say intervention should focus on normalizing the individual and their skills. In an inclusive model, we would say that intervention should help the individual interact with and access their community. So it's about connecting that person rather than saying, oh, you need to achieve a certain sense of, quote, normal. The third one, students with disabilities, and this could be a lot of students, can be included if they can keep up with core content. In an inclusive model, we would say that the learning environment should adapt to all kinds of learners and abilities. And I think this is broadly applicable, this sort of misconception and a more inclusive way of thinking about it. And then finally, interventions are determined by the experts and professionals, so kind of top down. In an inclusive model, we would say that we want to work with that student and our practices would be really driven by the strengths of that student and would really focus on lifting those things up. All right, so quickly we'll talk a little bit about universal design for learning. In a UDL model, we look at providing multiple means of engagement, of representation, and of action and expression. Rather than going through this slide in depth, I'm going to provide you with an example of what this looks like in practice. But really, we're looking at having students able to access their learning in a lot of different ways and express themselves in a lot of different ways. So if we could look at the next slide, these are some examples from Ruby Bridges Elementary, which is one of our inclusionary practices project demonstration sites. And what I love about these examples, if you look at the example on the left, this is a way for students to make different choices about what they do in the library. And so they have several choices. They can read in the library, they can do library learning, or they can draw 10 beautiful things. There are a lot of visual supports to help students make those choices. There are some further materials and further information about things they can do in the library on the right side there. And then we posted kind of our high expectations for students, not quite as rigid as like, these are the rules, be quiet, but we're really anchoring these things to kind of character traits and learner values. On the right side, I want to point out this communication board on the playground. So here's what I love about this. I've seen lots and lots of interventions for recess. My previous work was as a behavior specialist. So recess is a place where we see a lot of interfering behaviors. And so people always want to intervene during recess. And what I love about this is that this is a huge, huge sign. It might be hard to tell. It's, it's about the height of an adult. And it's really appealing and it's front and center when you walk out onto this playground. So rather than it being sort of on the side where only certain kids kind of access it and it's sort of the little weird area where we don't really go, this is this appealing, really exciting looking thing that's really centered in this playground. So all students are excited about it, engaging with it, looking at the different options and picture symbols. Think about all the students that this can support. And students who, don't have communication needs, can still use this as a sort of a prompt and reminder about like what I can do on the playground and what the expectations are. It really benefits all students completely, and then it benefits some students even more. And this is a really nice example of that kind of universal design. All right, so the last thing I want to share with you is just this notion that inclusion is really about developing communities of belonging. So this is a framework called the 10 Dimensions of Belonging that was developed by our technical assistance partners at the TIES Center. You can access this here with this QR code. And then the idea here is that there are, to achieve a sense of belonging, there are a lot of different parts. So in order to feel like we belong, we need to be heard, we need to be supported, we need to be needed and invited in, we need to be known and accepted. There's other pieces here too. So when we're thinking about making sure our schools are places that include all students, we can think about whether or not our students are experiencing these very specific pieces of this framework, and if not, what we can do to support them. All right, and with that, I'll turn it over to RJ.
Thanks, Jamie. So morning, everyone. My name is RJ Montan. I'm the director of MTSS working at OSPI. And our department is situated in the Center for the Improvement of Student Learning. And I'm appreciative of Jamie and their department of special education and teaming up with us as we talk about inclusionary practices, and thankful for Kristen and Katie and Emma today having me join. But so as we dive in, just thinking about multi-tiered system of supports, it's probably something many of you have heard before, and just want to provide maybe a different lens this morning as we dig into it. But it really does build on that public health model, where with this framework, we really try to maximize universal prevention supports. And MTSS really strives to achieve, well, in the educational field, educational equity. And what I mean by that is it looks to make sure that every student gets what they need when they need it. And the shift I'll ask you all to begin kind of making is the idea of, let's move away from the idea of it being sort of an intervention model and think of it more as an organizing framework for the adults in the system to help those students achieve those equitable outcomes. And in Washington State, we've broken it into 5 components. And these are not siloed components, they're completely interdependent. But those 5 components of team-driven shared leadership, the database decision-making, family, student, community engagement, continuum of supports, and evidence-based practices are those 5 components that we've sort of boiled down and said, like, all right, if we're looking at concentrating on improving our frameworks, these are the core components in the state of Washington that we should be focusing on. So if I go to there we go, perfect. So for most folks, this is probably what comes to mind when you think of MTSS. It's like this triangle. There's probably, if you Google it, there's thousands of iterations of this out there. This is sort of the model we've sort of become to love, because the way the image shows it really kind of identifies kind of some of the things I want to talk about here. So if we break it down, when we talk about a continuum of supports, it's talking about the intensity of an intervention or a support for students. Okay. It's not a place. There's no tier 2 room. There's no tier 3 room, and there's no tier 2 or tier 3 students. Really, it's a support. It's the identification of it. It describes the intensity of a support. And if you look at how this image is sort of constructed, the idea is that, like, with additional supports, we're not supplanting. Like, we're not, as Jamie was talking about earlier, we're not removing a student from a universal support in order to provide them with something more intensive. So it's in addition to that. So that would be like the idea of, like, all right, if I get my flu shot, I can stop washing my hands. Like, no, it's a prevention-based model. So we're going to continue to wash my hands, and I'm going to get my flu shot as an added bonus. Okay. So, and if we think about an intervention, if you want to, there's an animation on here. There you go. So if we think about like a tier 2 intervention, so something in addition to what 100% of our students are getting, right? If we think about that intervention, they're designed with clear entrance criteria, right? So we know that, like, hey, we're looking for the students who might need something in addition to core instruction, right? So it has clear entrance criteria and it has clear exit criteria. So a tier 2, even a tier 3 intervention, they're not permanent interventions in most cases, right? They're designed to fit a specific need until the student no longer needs that, or context changes and the student needs something different. And we can also shift from the idea of it being a deficit model, right? So if it's not just to close a gap in knowledge, it's not just used to close a gap in what a student might know about or might need to access core curriculum. If we think about a student who has a different lived experience, they may come into our setting perhaps already knowing how to engage with the content they might receive in a class, right? So we might need to provide them something in addition to, something more enriching for them to really access their education in that class. So some examples of this are, in certain settings, we think of high cap sometimes could be considered sort of an intervention, right? Clear entrance criteria, clear exit criteria, and it's not permanent, because once we kind of move through some upper grades, there become other options. So think about it in that sense, like it's not a permanent sentence to a place, and we don't categorize students by their tier 2 or tier. We don't categorize them by their support needs. Okay. Let's go back one. Yeah. So the numbers, you often see this like 80% of students should be making progress with core supports alone, 15 to 20 in tier 2, and 5%, accessing, tier 3 interventions. This is not to say that like, hey, once we have 20% of our students accessing tier 2 supports, we're full, no more students can access until there's room. That's not how we look at it. These bands are really to help us look at sort of the health of our system. All right, so we're not saying like tier 2 is full, tier 3 is full. It's just like, no, if we end up with more students accessing those interventions, we need to shift our perspective. So if you want to go to the next slide, what we need to shift our sort of our adult behavior from the idea of asking like, okay, instead of creating new and different interventions for different needs that pop up for students, every once in a while, like, and we should keep doing that. Like as our population shifts, we should keep doing that, but also looking at a very deliberate pause on a regular basis, saying like, time out. What are we doing at some of these elevated tiers that we can use to make our core more inclusive? For example, Jamie was talking about the communication board on the playground at Ruby Bridges. So rather than providing the student who needed the communication support to access the playground with the device in their hand to do that, if you put it up, everyone can access it. And even if I don't have communication needs to access the playground, I now know how my peers might need to, and I can communicate directly with them. So even if it's in a different language, I may not have language needs, as an English speaker in this country, but I can incidentally learn language to communicate with my peers if it's in a different language on the same communication board. So if we make it universally accessible, then what we're doing at sort of these tier 2 and tier 3 intervention levels can be more targeted. And so just shifting that idea of like, rather than like, what can I do to support the student, shift to like, all right, how can I take what we're doing to support some students to make it so that each of us can do a little bit to support the system to include all students. If you go to so again, another triangle. Like I honestly, I think I would get fired if I didn't have enough triangles in an MTSS talk, but this one, and the animation is probably more important in this. So the reason why we can't keep thinking about the idea of what intervention we need is because the reality is like staff and time and money are all finite resources in education, right? And they're probably too finite as we all kind of look at it. But there's no possible way for us to intervene our way out of something that either we're not addressing or something we're not handling really well at the core level. So the idea of like, it takes the idea of saying like, okay, look, many hands make lighter work, right? So if we take a look at what we're doing across sort of tier 2 and tier, like where we say like we have these tier 2 and tier 3 supports, if we take a look at what we're doing, we can look at some commonalities and say like, hey, maybe this is a practice, or parts of this are a practice that we need to have everyone engaging in at the tier 1 level or the universal level. And when I talk about these tiers, the one thing I want y'all to keep in mind is context matters, because what we're saying we're doing at tier 2 and tier 3 in one location might be completely different in another location because of the population needs. And to make you all just like maybe a bit more catatonic in the corner, the idea that like it's not static either. So as I'm talking about the idea of what can we sort of like push into core, as population shifts in districts and buildings happen, what we're doing we're categorizing as a tier 2 or tier 3 intervention might have to become core or might not need to be core as our population changes. So it's not static, and it requires that flip every once in a while to kind of look at what we're doing at advanced tiers to perhaps push down into some core supports. And if you want to go to the next slide, oftentimes I get it's like, okay, that's great. How do we even begin? So there is an intervention mapping tool, and I'll see if I can navigate through open windows here. I'll pop this into the chat. An intervention mapping tool, and this is a great place to start with teams in your buildings or in your districts to kind of look at, all right, kind of what are we doing at tier 1? What do we all agree is core instruction or core supports? And what are those tier 2 interventions we have set up where we're looking for students and we're plugging them in and hopefully supporting them? And what are we doing at tier 3? When you go through this, it just begin mapping this out. This is not sort of like you put stuff in, it spits out an answer for you. It really should be driving that discussion. And through this, sometimes discoveries happen where it's sort of like, oh, holy cow, we're addressing a need at tier 2 that we're not even providing baseline support at tier 1. So that's sort of an impossible task. You're never going to resolve something at an advanced tier that you're not addressing in tier 1. So the idea of removing a student from core instruction to provide them a tier 2 support, that's sort of like you begin chasing this problem that's not you can't ever solve. So one, looking at sort of like what are we not doing at tier 1 that we're trying to intervene our way out of at tier 2 or tier 3. The other thing that you can kind of begin to look at is like, okay, there's no sustainability to some of these things. So some things that we're calling sort of like tier 1, if there's only one person handling it, that's timeout. That's not a tier 1 support. Tier 1 would mean that everyone has the skill set and the ability to sort of support it across the given setting. So this tool is great. It begins driving some conversation, and it also sort of like allows you to look at like, all right, do we even have tools in place to measure whether or not this is working? And if we don't, is it worth sort of looking at, or is it worth perhaps sort of like leaving this aside if we're not seeing the positive outcomes we need? So, in thinking about, so Emma, sorry.
Yeah, so I just want to really thank you for bringing that tool forward to our group here today, because there are things that we know are very, very highly effective and very inclusionary for our multilingual learners that act as universal supports. And so as your teams are looking at those tools that have been brought forward and some examples of some wonderful practices, we would also encourage you, when thinking specifically about multilingual learners, to ensure that English language development is in and accessible at all levels of intensity or all tiers of supports. We would also encourage you to ask, how is culturally responsive pedagogy working in your system? And how are we ensuring that that is welcoming all members of our community into belonging and into learning? We also want to think about how are we building on the full linguistic abilities, including opportunities for translanguaging for our students, and what opportunities for goal setting are there? We know language learners need to set goals, and they're not the only population that does. So how can we ensure that that's happening at all levels of support? And of course, how will students show what they've learned? When Jamie was showing us a little bit about our UDL charts that we frequently use in these systems of support, action and expression. Is there more than one option? And how are students at different proficiency levels able to show what they know? And on our next slide, there's another population that we need to make sure we're thinking about. Our linguistically gifted students, our linguistic geniuses, if you were with us at WABE for Dr. Alfaro's keynote speech, really focus in on the fact that our multilingual students, particularly our students who are trilingual, who are multilingual beyond what we would expect if we look on paper. How are we ensuring that there's an inclusionary framework that it includes their gifts and their genius in our high ability or gifted and talented education systems? How are we cultivating a shared mindset? And how are we using the essential features and teaching and learning for gifted and talented or highly capable learners to develop rich academic language and rich opportunities for learning that may be at that additional enrichment far beyond stage that we sometimes forget when we're thinking about multilingual learners and a system of support that includes all learners?
Thank you, Emma. And this reminds me actually of a classroom I taught in many years back in California, where we had an inclusionary type of system. And I taught the class that was clustered with highly capable students and with multilingual learners and with students who had IEPs. And it was amazing how being able to provide both additional scaffolds for language learners, but also enriching experiences and rigorous instruction benefited every student in that classroom. And so I know that all of these come together when we can really think about designing Tier 1 instruction that is going to include all students and is really going to be effective for all students. So thank you. Thanks to all of our guest speakers. And we are going to move on now to hear from another guest speaker. We have Mika Dean with us from the Office of the Education Ombuds, who is going to share a little bit about what they do and some of the supports they can provide. Mika?
Hello. Hi, good morning, everyone. I'm sorry, I can't share my screen. So oh, you have it. Okay, thank you. So we're actually going to start, if you can skip this intro and skip this one. For the sake of, I'm right here. Thank you so much. So I'm just going to jump right into it. Thank you, everyone, for having me. I really appreciate it. So what OEO does, OEO is short for Washington State Governor's Office of the Education Ombuds. Even though we're housed within the governor's office, I like to tell folks that, no, we don't speak to him. No, we have no clue what he's doing next as far as policy goes. And so we cannot put in a word for you about how his politics is going. So we're very sorry about that, but that's something that we are not able to do. But essentially, our services are free, confidential, and it is independent from districts as well as OSPI itself. And so we offer individual support with information and informal conflict resolution, training, and outreach and policy work. So those are the three buckets that we operate from when you think of our work. So individual support, we do families and training and outreach. We go into the community. And as far as the policy work, we're required by law to sit by legislator to sit on certain work group committees or policy committees to be a voice for the community where it may be missing otherwise. So OEO, we have a strategic plan that's started in 2022 to 2023. We're in the process of reconfiguring that strategic plan right now. And it was to help to reduce the opportunity gap. So as we talk about inclusion, we have to talk about the differences that comes to opportunity within districts and even within schools and even within the community. And then that's a question about access. Who is able to access what services? Who are they available to? Who are they freely being offered to? And also sometimes we don't like to believe so, but who are they not being provided to? And that could be for a plethora of reasons. So we have the strategic plan population that we prioritize that will be out of school, including students with disabilities, receiving partial school days, people of color, Black or Indigenous, those experiencing homelessness and kinship or foster care, involved in the juvenile justice or juvenile rehabilitation systems, immigrant, refugee, or asylee or migrant, or students, families whose primary language is not English, so multilingual learners, and receiving wraparound or intensive services WISE or Children's Long-Term Inpatient Program, which is CLIP services. And those are more around behavioral health needs. Thank you. So on our website, we have a ton of information available as well as toolkits to help families and district employees or even those involved in the education system to help navigate those systems. And so what we like to do is provide families with as much information as possible, because sometimes you won't be able to directly get to an ombuds. And how we work, we have 3 senior ombuds who are responsible for our casework. And then we have 2 associate ombuds who field incoming calls. And so sometimes folks have a quick question about like, hey, I'm having an issue with transportation. What can I do as a parent? And we're able to quickly answer that without it being triaged into an official ombuds case. So that is our website. We have a ton of information. If you could just direct families to it, if you want to go to it and look it over, that's a possibility. Some of the most frequent common questions that we come into is regarding special education, from the evaluation to IEP development to reviews of behavioral plans and more. And we see multilingual learners having an issue on every one of these common questions. So in special education, when you talk about inclusion, you have to talk about the families. Sometimes schools feel like because they're giving the services to the student and the student is doing well, that the communication, therefore, with the family is in English, and the family has communicated that, hey, this is hard for me to understand. I'm not feeling a part of my child's academic career. Is there a way you can get this information to me in my language? And a lot of the times, schools will say they don't have the resources, or districts say they don't have the resources. And so the common questions that comes up say, hey, I really need to participate in my child's special education. I'm unable to because of this barrier. We come in to help remove barriers. Student discipline, because of that language and cultural barrier. So most times the behavior is seen as a negative, and it's causing seclusion and exclusion instead of inclusion. And so we kind of help come to the table to have that conversation about cultural awareness as far as it goes in supporting those multilingual learners. Harassment and bullying, because sometimes you have students transferring in high school or in middle school at really those prime moments in life where they're shifting into a whole new dynamic as far as culturally and also language wise. And so they're having issues with harassment and bullying, just being in a new place with different sets of norms and values. And so we come in and we help kind of facilitate those conversations between families and schools to make sure that that multilingual learner feels safe in their environment. Enrollment and transportation, especially with documentation, depending on why the family moved here. We've had issues with schools really making it a struggle for families to access the education because of documentation. Attendance is a big one right now, just because the laws around attendance is very different from place to place. And so some families don't know, like, by law, you have to send your child to school. And if you miss so many days, then they're going to refer you to truancy court. And so we help them also navigate that process. And then language access, which I alluded to earlier, the right to interpretation and translation of specific documents. So working with OEO, and I can end right here on this slide, is you start by contacting us by either phone or email or online. We'll take some basic information and listen to the question or concern. We'll try to provide quick information and resources. Like I said, we've had families call and say, hey, I have an IEP meeting tomorrow. They keep providing me, I don't understand this document. I don't understand what's going on. They have a family, they're asking if there's a family member that could come with me to help interpret, and which is very inappropriate. That's something that is not supposed to be done, because there are terms that we use in the education system that may not be familiar to that family, or that language that needs broken down further that an interpreter can do, which a family member would not be able to do. So once again, we're talking about inclusion. It's being sure that everyone around the table is understanding what's going on and how they can support. And then we'll try to provide quick information resources. Like I said, if it is within the strategic plan, we schedule a time with the senior education ombuds to understand more about the situation and work collaboratively to try to resolve the concerns. We can work with a family for up to 120 days in a school year to try to help reach a resolution. And with written permission, we can reach out to schools directly. We could sometimes attend meetings virtually as part of efforts to reach resolution. Resolution might involve clarifying concerns and options, because sometimes it's just a breakdown in communication. One side is not fully understanding the other. And for the families, is that feel like they just have a need that is not being met, or they have a voice that's not being heard. And we're a neutral party that tries to bring both parties to the table and help reach a kind of amicable way of understanding the situation. We are not an enforcement agency. We do share information with families and students about their rights and options for formal complaint or dispute resolution, but we do not advocate for or represent families in those processes. So that's about what we do kind of in a nutshell. That's a way that you can contact, once again, by phone, online, or by email. And then stay in touch. If you would like to follow us on any of our social medias or our website, please feel free. And that's all I have today. Thank you so much.
Mika, thank you so much for joining us. We know the Office of Education Ombuds can be a huge support, particularly to our multilingual families. And so don't be afraid to refer families directly to them. Sometimes working within a district, you might have a hard time getting traction with things, and you might even know that this family is not getting their needs met, or the student's not getting their needs met. They can be a great third party to bring in that brings that neutral perspective and can advocate on behalf of that family, and with that family help support them in understanding their rights and what they can do in ways that sometimes an insider might have a hard time doing for various political reasons within a district. So they just are a really great resource and very accessible for multilingual families. So thank you so much, Mika. We're glad to have you, and very glad to make sure everyone knows about the great resources that you have available. The OEO website also has some really nice things around translation and interpretation, tips for interpreters, that kind of thing. You can download those off their website, so be sure to check out their website. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Leslie Huff. I know we had a lot packed into this agenda, Leslie, so we'll try to get through things quickly, but I know you have a few updates. We know WIDA access testing started this week, and want to make sure everybody's on track for whatever they need. Leslie?
Right. Hello, everyone. Good morning. Here's some important dates. I think you all have this slide deck, so I'm going to go ahead and just let you hang on to those. I don't need to go through them. I think they're pretty self-explanatory. Next slide. Yeah, this is not new news. We do have new exit criteria this year for students in grades 3 through 12 who score a 4.3 to a 4.6. We still have the 4.7 is an automatic. They are proficient. They are exiting program. But for 4.3 to 4.6 folks, they have a secondary data point of their current ELA SBA score. So if they have a 3 or a 4 this year on the ELA SBA and they score maybe a 4.4 on WIDA, they also exit. The only exception to this is 9th graders who do not have a same grade level SBA score. So we cannot use an off-grade score for this process. Grade 11 and 12 can use the grade 10 score, because in grade 11 or 12, it would be the same test. And there is at this point no change to how you would report. And this new exit criteria will be something that OSPI tells you. You do not have to get a committee together and figure this out. OSPI will let you know who exits your program using the same data point that we do now. All right, next. Ordering additional materials. This seems to be going pretty well. I think I'm all caught up. A couple of things that are catching people up. You must use the additional materials tab in WIDA AMS. You cannot use the ordering materials tab. That's not something that we use in Washington at all. It just exists in WIDA's system. So it's going to look like like it's not working if you try to use materials, ordering materials. So make sure you use additional materials. Also, I have to approve every single order. So as much as you can, consolidate those orders so that I'm approving maybe 20 a day instead of 75 a day or something like that. It's going to help everybody get more streamlined service. And then if you use district level only under the school dropdown on ordering materials, the only option that I can approve as far as the school that these materials are ordered for is the one that's called district level additional materials site. If you order for an elementary school or a middle school, I cannot approve that order, and you'll have to go in and reorder those materials anyways. On the materials ordering, we do know that there was a coding error in the pre-ID file. So if you are losing your mind because the materials that you received for the alt access are not the materials that you ordered, it's not your fault. You did nothing wrong. It was a coding error in the system. Just go ahead and order the materials that you need. If you don't have the materials that were intended to be ordered, particularly for alt access. We know that there's a lot of errors in that space because of the coding error. Please just go ahead and hop on additional materials and order the materials that you need. Next, Kristen. Ordering labels. If you cannot order the student-specific labels, those are a one-time thing. They have to come from the December file. So, but you can order school-specific labels. These are the yellow ones. They do require you to bubble in more information. As we all know with WIDA assessments, we can only bubble with a pencil. But these are the things that you need to tell me, and send your request for yellow school labels. Those requests can only come from the state to DRC, so send it to me, ELPA assessments at k12.wa.us. And include the district name, school name, all of these other points there in your email. And I will forward that on to DRC for you. If you're testing students with visual impairments, I think I have one more to get out today for the folks that I have an NDA for. So if you need OPA 21 materials, which this is any student with visual impairments needing a large print or Braille assessment that is not taking the WIDA alt. So any student needing a Braille or large print assessment, these were ordered in the fall. We do have some new orders that we are trying to see if we can get some additional tests for those, particularly 6-8 Braille tests are, we're going to try to get some more of those and get them out. But if you need one of these, send us an email. If you ordered one of these, look in your email for an email from Alicia Hartzell with the non-disclosure agreement. That has to be signed and returned to Alicia before we can send these materials to you. If you have an alternate assessment Braille supplement, if you have a student with visual impairments and you need a Braille supplement for the alternate access, also send us an email. We have created a Braille supplement for you and can send that out as soon as we get the email, as soon as we get the request. All right, I think that's all for me, but I'll stay on and answer any questions that come up on the chat.
Thanks, Leslie. And hopefully we will have time, a few minutes for breakout groups, and if folks can stay a little longer, a little bit more. So just a few quick things, reminders, etc. One is just around substitute shortages. This has been coming up. It's been surfacing again this year, where we have heard about multilingual learner teachers and specialists being pulled to sub or on like a substitute rotation so that they have to go and fill in gen ed classrooms. And it's just a reminder that student services cannot be disrupted because of pulling of their teacher to sub in a gen ed classroom. And also that affects your funding source. If that teacher is being paid for out of TBIP or Title III funds, they cannot be used to substitute in a gen ed classroom unless you have actually designated that as part of their job and you have designated FTE towards it and set up a working schedule where they can still provide all of the student services that they need to provide and have, you know, that rotation or that schedule that will allow them to substitute on an occasional basis. But that has to be done in advance. If it's they're just being pulled on a regular basis, it is supplanting. It is taking TBIP funds and using them for general education, and that is definitely out of compliance. So please make sure that your district is doing this correctly. We will be sending out another bulletin as a reminder to all superintendents and principals and everyone to make sure that this is not occurring because it is violating student civil rights if their services are disrupted, and it is also violating the rules around TBIP funding. On another note, if you do have to pull in a long-term substitute for a TBIP funded teacher and you are not able to find someone who is fully endorsed, you can still use that TBIP funding for that long-term sub on a temporary basis. However, you should ensure that that teacher who is doing that long-term sub has enough training to be able to appropriately provide support to multilingual learners. So that is the one exception. Just reminders, our next info session will be on braided funding, how to use not just TBIP and Title III, but also Title I, LAP, other funding to support your ML services. And we also wanted to remind you of our language learning regional networks in each area. We have additional meetings coming up. If you've never joined one of these, please reach out to your program supervisor and learn more. These are a great opportunity to interact with your colleagues. And we have, of course, our dual and heritage language professional learning, including our new book study that is on collaboration and co-teaching for dual language learners that just launched last week. And the authors, Joan LaChance and Andrea Honigsfeld, are actually joining us for all of those virtual sessions. So you get to hear directly from them as well. So if you're in dual and want to learn more, buy the book and join the book study. And also a heads up, this spring we are going to be offering some more WIDA facilitated webinars, one on expanding reading instruction with multilingual learners, and another on bringing language into focus with the focus on expectations, functions, and features. So these are coming up starting February 9th. You'll be able to enroll through PD Enroller. We'll put it in our newsletter so that you can click on it. Session 1, Session 2 of these are the same thing. They're just repeats of the same courses. So you might just look at which dates you can do and sign up for the set of dates that work for you. And with that, we're going to open up our breakout rooms for a few minutes of check-in time. Any questions you have on any of the topics today, you can join us